Hey guys, it's Weaviver, welcome back. Today we're doing new VR benchmarks comparing the frame rates and performance side by side between the Samsung Odyssey Windows Mixed Reality headset and the Pimax 5K Plus. In the previous video, we did VR benchmarks on the Pimax 5K Plus with the RTX 2080 Ti, the GTX 1080 Ti and my GTX 1070 laptop in 12 first-person shooter games, and I think many of you got disappointed with the GTX 1070 laptop performance using the Pimax. While the GTX 1070 might not be a high-end GPU, it's still quite a powerful graphic card, and I wonder if the low performance using the 5K Plus is caused by the Pimax render or poor performance optimizations. So I decided to run these benchmarks all over again on the same GTX 1070 laptop with identical in-game settings, but this time using the Samsung Odyssey headset. Is the Samsung Odyssey render more optimized for Steam VR and Oculus Home games? Is the lower resolution and more narrow field of view on the Odyssey resulting in a more acceptable frame rate in these games? And how much difference in overall performance can we expect on a GTX 1070 laptop running these games on a Samsung Odyssey versus a Pimax 5K Plus? Well, let's find out. Before we begin, a big thanks to all my lovely Patreons for supporting my channel, and a special thanks to my official sponsors Commander Darklight, Art Armin and VR Ambassador. So I'm using identical in-game settings as last time, and the Samsung Odyssey is running with Steam VR super sampling of 100% in all upcoming tests. This will not give me the best possible sharpness and clarity of course, but at least an acceptable image quality and resolution in games, fully comparable to the Pimax 5K Plus running with Python at 1.0 and Steam VR super sampling left on 100% as well. Let's not forget though that using these settings, the reported resolution on the Pimax 5K Plus is much higher than the Odyssey, not only because of the wider field of view but also the different rendering pipeline. If you want more info about the GTX 1070 laptop and all the settings, including the in-game settings for these VR benchmarks, check out my previous video and I will give you the link in the video description. Now let's save the analysis for later and jump into the benchmarks right away. Starting off with zero caliber again, we can immediately see a more acceptable performance on the Odyssey with an average frame rate of around 50 frames per second and sometimes up on numbers around 70. The zero caliber is a very GPU demanding game, so we cannot really expect 90 frames per second here, at least not with a GTX 1070 laptop. I never hit 90 frames per second on the Odyssey even once during the entire benchmark of this game. And remember, I told you this game needs at least a GTX 1080 Ti on the Pimax to really be playable. In the more intense scenes with a lot of action, the frame rate also drops on the Odyssey to around 40 or 45 frames per second, but it's still way more playable on the Samsung compared to the Pimax. I also have to add that there are some major dips in the frame rate on the Odyssey, sometimes going even below minimum Pimax frame rate. I'm not sure if this is caused by the Windows Mixed Reality render or software, but something is wrong when the frame rate suddenly jumps down to 16 frames per second. I did this benchmark several times on the Odyssey and also rebooted the PC in between, but the low frames per second dips was always there, especially in this game. Next game is Gunheart, another very GPU and CPU heavy VR title, and surprisingly enough, the performance increase with the Samsung Odyssey is rather small, with an average frame rate of around 50 frames per second on the Odyssey versus 42 on the Pimax. It really makes me wonder if the game gets bottlenecked by the GPU on the laptop, as the big resolution difference between these headsets is not affecting the performance much at all. Also, the GPU utilization is really low here. In both scenarios, as soon as we hit the more chaotic locations with many creatures and enemies, the performance drops even more, and occasionally with frame rates below 30 frames per second on the Pimax, but surprisingly also on the Samsung Odyssey. The maximum frame rates are way higher on the Odyssey though, peaking around 65 frames per second, while the Pimax struggles a lot more, never even reaching 50 frames per second. All in all, this is clearly a game not made for laptops, and especially not a GTX 1070 laptop. The game Apex Cybernetic really challenged my laptop when I played it on the Pimax 5K Plus, and it seems that the lower resolution with Samsung Odyssey doesn't really help here either, at least not with a GTX 1070 laptop. In this first scene with a lot of zombies, we hardly see any difference in the frame rate, which is almost stuck below 50. Again, the CPU frame times are significantly high, so this is definitely a game that my laptop cannot handle. Also, the GPU utilization is extremely low with the Odyssey, many times below 40%, and I can promise you I made these tests 4 times with PC reboots in between, also closing all unnecessary background services to make sure nothing unnecessary is running and bottlenecking the system. Something is just not right here. Looking at the right side, the laptop struggles with the Pimax even more, of course, but here we can at least see the GPU being used above 70%. We even got some heavy frames per second dips down to 15 frames per second on the Odyssey. Very strange result, I gotta say, and I'm not sure what's really causing it. It's definitely not the recordings, as it's handled by the GPU using NVENC recording. Moving on, Wardas was running surprisingly well on the Pimax with the GTX 1070 laptop, a lot of times reaching 90 frames per second and averaging above 80 in total. In the last benchmark video where I tested the game also with the RTX 2080 Ti and the GTX 1080 Ti, I was impressed over the tiny difference in overall performance and playability between the GPUs on Pimax. Now here comes the weird part though. On the Samsung Odyssey I get lower average frame rates after the whole completed session running this game, despite the fact we're using a much lower resolution with the Odyssey. Here I'm not sure we can even blame the CPU to be the bottleneck. Most of the time the frame times are fine, but the GPU utilization is once again extremely low. I think I really need to investigate this further, as I personally cannot believe the Odyssey results are supposed to be such low on a GTX 1070 laptop. If you have any clues what's going on here, let me know, guys. Now let's try Robo Recall. In the first scenes of Robo Recall, we see a similar pattern where the performance is hardly noticeable between the Samsung Odyssey and the Pimax. Both the GPU and CPU struggles with high frame times, and the GPU utilization is very low using the Odyssey once again. But moving further into the city, we start to get better frame rates on the Odyssey, and now we start to see the advantage of using a low resolution. We get a frame rate above 60 frames per second, and the game gets much more playable. Unfortunately, in the slow motion scenes, the GTX 1070 really struggles again, but not as much on the Odyssey as it did on the Pimax at least. Looking at the chart with minimum, maximum and average frame rates, the game performance is definitely more acceptable on the Odyssey, even if I was expecting more, to be honest. Now Doom VFR. Immediately when I started off Doom VFR, I noticed that the game is heavily optimized for VR and really uses the GPU more properly. While the high resolution using the Pimax 5K Plus is a bit too much for the GTX 1070 laptop, I must say the game runs really well on the Odyssey. Most of the time we have a butter smooth frame rate of 90 frames per second with only some very short dips to low 80s and sometimes high 70s, probably caused by explosion and effects. If you saw my last video, you know that I'm using most of the in-game settings on Ultra in this game, and also the highest possible in-game anti-aliasing, so having that in mind, I have to say the results here using the Odyssey are quite impressive. We have low frame times on both the GPU and the CPU, and Doom VFR is the first game that really shows the potential of the Samsung Odyssey, especially when we pair it with a GTX 1070 laptop. The Pimax 5K Plus also gets much lower minimum frame rates and never reaches 90 frames per second throughout the whole testing session. Pavlov VR uses parallel projection on the Pimax, and this may be why the game struggles a lot with the GTX 1070 using the high resolution. I never reached higher frame rate than 75 frames per second on the Pimax when running this test, and sometimes it could go down to low 50s. On the Samsung Odyssey, on the other hand, there's a totally different story. The game plays smooth most of the time, averaging close to 90 frames per second with only some minor and occasional dips below 80. As this is a fast competitive online first-person shooter, it needs the proper frame rate to really shine and give you the needed accuracy and time timing to win those matches. With the lower resolution on the Odyssey, the game does not look as good as it does on the Pimax of course, but the maps are not huge, so you really do not need to aim on targets hundreds of meters away. If you're ready to sacrifice the better field of view and resolution on the Pimax, I'm sure you will have a much more fun playing Pavlov on the Samsung Odyssey, at least with the GTX 1070. Now let's try Onward again. Onward is really not a GPU demanding game, and running it on the Pimax with GTX 1070 you will most likely have no problems playing it, even if the frame rate jumps a lot between 70 and 90 frames per second. The average frame rate on the Pimax being close to 80 was not bad at all, having in mind we're playing on a laptop, but the occasional frame rate dips to low 50s could be a bit frustrating and distracting, I have to admit. With the Samsung Odyssey we have a silky smooth gameplay most of the time, with only a very short and random frame rate dips down to 80 or maybe mid 70 range. Of course it all depends on what map you're playing in Onward, and the desert map may not be the most complex one here, but still, with an average frame rate of above 89 frames per second in this test with the Samsung Odyssey, we get once again proven that the high resolutions Pimax is forcing us to use are not really preferred for a mid-range GPU system, especially a laptop with a GTX 1070 or lower. Raw data was almost unplayable on the Pimax 5K Plus with a GTX 1070 laptop. We got an average frame rate below 45 frames per second without even reaching 50 frames per second at all during the first mission in the campaign. The minimum frame rates could go below 30 even, which made the game basically unplayable because of the fast-paced action and aiming. So I was happily surprised my laptop with a GTX 1070 actually could handle the game pretty well with the Samsung Odyssey. Almost the entire first mission I saw stable frame rate of 90 frames per second, or at least very close to 90, and with very good GPU utilization it reaches above 88 frames per second on average. The only problem here though are some occasional dips to low 60s when some effects are rendered, for example, but the minimum frame rates didn't occur often and the game was fully playable on the Samsung anyway. Looking at the chart, the performance increase is huge going from the Pimax to the Odyssey, and this time it may be a good idea to skip the Pimax if you're using a GTX 1070. As mentioned in the last video, Wanted Killer is not really a GPU and CPU friendly VR shooter. The frame rate jumps all over the place in this game without any kind of logic, I think. On the Pimax the game is barely playable with the GTX 1070, and there is no in-game settings we can adjust either, as far as I can see. The average frame rate on the Pimax was below 45 and we could hardly reach 50 frames per second during the whole mission. With Samsung Odyssey it gets much better and the game is mostly playable now, even if it's far from perfect. Once again we see some problems with the frame rate dips, and here I got some real stutters down to 30 frames per second with the Odyssey. The CPU seems to be working quite hard in this game, so it might be a CPU bottleneck when the stutters occur. Anyway, with an average frame rate of 66 frames per second, it's at least playable on a GTX 1070 laptop. Standout is the next game we're gonna try, and this game did not impress on me on the GTX 1070 with the Pimax, and even if the average frame rate of above 60 frames per second does not sound that bad, I must say it could get a little bit annoying playing this game with aiming accuracy being halted by the low frame rates, which sometimes went down to around 50 frames per second. In this game you're often aiming on targets very far away, which is quite a challenge in VR, and with low frame rates it all gets even more difficult now. I must say I was expecting better performance running it on the Samsung Odyssey, but surprisingly enough I could not see a big difference in performance at all. I could actually see the frame rate hit 90 frames per second a few times, but most of the time the game was running around 70 frames per second or even below, which really isn't optimal. The last game in this benchmark is Alpha Mike Foxtrot, which definitely runs better on the Odyssey with a GTX 1070 laptop. The frame rate is mostly around 90 90 frames per second using the Odyssey, and even if I can see some heavy dips below 70, I did not find it distracting. On the Pimax we could barely hit 90 frames per second at all, despite playing quite a small map. But there is a huge problem here though. Alpha Mike Foxtrot looks way better on the Pimax headset. I don't know why, but using the Odyssey everything looks very jaggy and quite low resolution and without any clarity. When using the Pimax 5K Plus, everything just looked so much more defined and it was so much more easier to aim on the targets thanks to the much higher resolution and lower screen door effect. So even if the game runs way more smooth on the Odyssey, I find it harder to play because of the much worse clarity, jagged edges everywhere causing aiming problems, at least for me. So now I know what you're thinking. How about motion reprojection? Sure, Samsung Odyssey has in fact motion reprojection feature that can be enabled, which is a very similar one to the Oculus ASW or asynchronous space warp reprojection. This feature makes almost any VR game or VR simulator to run fully smooth as long as the GPU can render a stable 45 frames per second or above. So yes, if you are struggling with the frame rates using the Samsung Odyssey, just enable the motion reprojection and it will most likely make your game smooth and fully playable anyway. But I did not enable motion reprojection for this benchmark as I wanted to see what real frame rates a GTX 1070 laptop can render with the Samsung Odyssey. Also remember, motion reprojection will never be as smooth and perfect as real frame rate of 90 frames per second, and some people cannot even handle motion reprojection without getting nausea or motion sickness. This is why I think we always should aim to play VR games with the frame rate as high as possible to achieve and avoid reprojection, using it only as a last resort. Anyway, after benchmarking all these 12 first-person shooters, I must say I'm a little bit confused now. I was really expecting much higher frame rates using the Samsung Odyssey, and in many of these tests the frame rate numbers just didn't convince me. Comparing the resolutions between the Samsung Odyssey and the Pimax 5K Plus, we should get at least a double frame rate in every test on the Samsung Odyssey, but apparently that's not the case. I'm starting to wonder if the Windows Mixed Reality render drivers or software has some problems with the performance, or maybe it's the fact that I'm using a GTX 1070 laptop, which is a little bit bottlenecked by the i7-7700HQ processor running quite hot at times. Well, I don't know, what do you think guys? Please let me know what you think about these benchmarks and let me know if there is something I have totally missed or should know about. I would really appreciate that. I hope you enjoyed this video and big thanks for watching. Please leave a like and do not forget to subscribe to my channel and hit that bell button to not miss out my upcoming VR related videos, benchmarks, reviews, gameplays and much more. Once again, a huge thanks to all my Patreon supporters and a special thanks to my official sponsors on Patreon, Commander Darklight, Art Armin and VR Ambassador. I'll see you in the next video. Cheers guys!